Farmer finds 1,300-year-old globe buried, but what was inside is astounding. The hoe struck differently that morning. Silas had heard many different sounds coming from the earth over more than 30 years working that patch of ground. He could tell the noise of the blade cutting through a thick root from the blade hitting shallow rock, from the iron sinking into waterlogged soil. But that sound was different. It was hollow. It was deep. It was as if the ground had a stomach, and he had hit it. He stopped, looked down, struck again. The same sound, low and round, travelled up his arms to his neck. He stood there for a long while, just staring at the ground, as if waiting for the earth to speak first. It didn't, but it kept its secret for only a little longer. When Silas came back with the shovel and started digging, the sun was already high. The soil in that corner of the property was red and hard, and sweat ran down the neck of the blue shirt he wore every time he went to the back 40. He was a man who didn't throw away anything that still served, so that shirt had more patches than any new piece he could buy, and he didn't care one bit. He dug for almost an hour, tossing the dirt aside, opening a hole that grew slowly until the tip of the shovel scraped against something solid and curved. Silas dropped the shovel, knelt at the edge of the hole, and began removing the earth with his hands. Little by little, a surface appeared, grey, thick, covered in fine cracks like webs that time had drawn there. Round, perfectly round. It was too big to be any stone he had ever seen around those parts. When it became clear that it wasn't an ordinary rock, that it was a sphere, a ball the size of an overturned water barrel, Silas sat on the edge of the hole, unable to move. He was a man of few words. He had learned that from his father, who had learned it from his grandfather, and none of the three had ever thought that silence needed to be filled. But at that moment, looking at that huge thing emerging from the earth, he muttered something. Just one thing. My God. He didn't call anyone that hour. He went to get water, drank, looked at the hole again, as if expecting it to disappear when he blinked. It didn't disappear. It stayed there, that enormous sphere with the cracks and the green moss that had survived underground. Who knows how? Only at night, when he got home with his hands dirty up to his elbows, did he tell his wife. Martha was washing the dishes when he came in through the back door. She had known him for 26 years, and she knew right away that something different had happened, because he had that boyish look she only saw on very rare occasions. The look of when he wasn't sure what to feel. "What is it?" she asked, without turning from the utility sink. "I found something in the field." "What thing?" "A ball." Martha turned, dried her hands on her apron. "A ball. A stone ball. This big." He spread his arms the width of a barrel. "Buried out there in that corner that never produced well." She looked at him for a while. "Drunk?" "Martha?" "I'm asking?" "I'm not drunk. I'll show you tomorrow morning." And he did. The next morning, Martha went to the hole with him, looked at the sphere, stood silent for a long time, and then said the only thing that made sense to say at that moment. "Silas, you have to tell Mrs. Beatrice." Mrs. Beatrice was his mother, 72 years old, arthritis in her hands, memory sharper than any knife Silas had stored in the storage barn, and a relationship with that land that went back long before he was born. She was the one who knew the history of every inch of that property, because she was the one who had heard her father tell it, who had heard his grandfather tell it. In that family, the land had a tongue, and Mrs. Beatrice was the one who understood the language. She lived in the old house, the one at the back of the property, about 300 yards from the new one, a house of dark bricks, small windows, and a porch where she sat every morning with a mug of tea clasped in her knobby hands. Silas went there before breakfast. He told her about the sphere without embellishing anything, straight to the point, just as she herself had taught him. When he finished, Mrs. Beatrice was silent. That silence of hers he knew well, the silence of someone rummaging through a very deep inner drawer. "Take me there," she said at last. "Mom, the ground is uneven. You might—" "Take me there, Silas." She walked to the hole with her son's arm for support, slowly, but steady. When she reached the edge and looked down at that enormous, cracked sphere, her hand gripped his arm with a strength he hadn't expected. "That stone," she said very softly. "I've heard of it." Silas looked at his mother. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer right away. She stood staring at the sphere for a time that felt much longer than it was, and when she turned to him, her eyes held an expression he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, it wasn't surprise, it was something akin to recognition. "There's a lot I've never told you," she said. "About this land, about this family." And then Silas knew that this morning was going to be much longer than he had planned. They went back to the porch of the old house. Mrs. Beatrice told him to get the tea, sat down in the wooden chair that had been worn into the same shape for 30 years, and began to speak. She said that her grandfather, when he was young, had found a reference to that stone in a set of old notebooks that belonged to the great-grandfather. Silas wasn't the first to know it was there. It was his great-grandfather who had buried it. Silas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Buried it? Why? Because of what was inside. The silence lasted a second. "Inside," he repeated. "Inside," she confirmed. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Beatrice explained what she knew, which wasn't much, because her grandfather had been a cautious man and hadn't written everything down. But enough for her to understand what was at stake. Decades and decades ago, when that land was still being divided among the first families that arrived in that region, there was an agreement. An agreement made between Silas's great-grandfather and the great-grandfather of another family that lived nearby, the Harrisons. An agreement that was never put on paper, never taken anywhere official. It was made by word of mouth, as was done in those days, between men who respected one another. But inside that stone sphere there was something. Silas's great-grandfather had put something in there before burying it, and the reason he had done it was the same reason no one had ever spoken about it out loud since then. "What did he put in there, Mom?" Mrs. Beatrice looked at her own hands, the swollen joints, the skin thin as tissue paper, a letter and a map of the land that was supposed to go to the Harrisons and never reached their hands. Silas took a moment to understand what she was saying, and when he understood, he felt the solid ground beneath his feet waver a little as if the earth had breathed. The Harrisons. That name he knew very well. The neighboring family, separated from his property by a barbed wire fence that had caused more strife than anything else in his life. Caleb Harrison, the current head of the family, was a man with whom Silas exchanged no more than 5 words a month, and even those were short words. The dispute between the two families over the exact boundary line between their properties had started long before either of them was born, and neither knew exactly where it came from. Now he was beginning to understand. "Look, I had to stop here when I read this for the first time, because we spend our lives fighting for what we think is ours, and we don't always know that the root of it all might be literally buried in the ground." "Mom," he said slowly, "are you telling me that his great-grandfather had a right to a part of this land here?" "I'm telling you that Silas's great-grandfather, your great-grandfather, made that decision to bury the proof of it, for reasons I don't exactly know." She paused. "But I know he was the one who did it. And I knew because his grandfather told me, when I was already married to your father, that there was a secret in this land, that there was something buried here that he was afraid someone would find one day, but also afraid that no one would ever find it." "That doesn't make sense." "It does, son. It makes perfect sense when you're old enough to know that some truths are so heavy you're afraid both to carry them and to throw them away." Silas was silent for a long while. The sun was rising and he must have been thinking 1,000 things at once, because when he got up from the chair, his expression was that of someone who had just received news that changes the ground beneath your feet. But the next thing he said wasn't about the land, it was about the stone. "How do we open that thing?" Mrs. Beatrice gave a small smile. "His grandfather said it had a crack that wasn't a crack, on the south side." Silas went back to the back 40. He climbed down into the hole. He began to examine the surface of the sphere centimeter by centimeter, running his fingers over the cracks, looking for the one that was different. The sun was strong, and sweat ran down his neck. Martha had come along this time and was at the edge of the hole looking down. "Find it?" "Not yet. It's on the other side." "I know it's on the south side, Martha. Then go to the south side. He went around, and he found it. It was an almost imperceptible line, wider than the others by maybe 2 millimeters, and it ran in an arc across the surface of the stone as if it carefully divided that lower half. Silas placed the tip of the shovel there and pressed gently, then harder. The sphere resisted. It resisted more. He pushed with the kind of force you use when you know something's going to give but not when, and suddenly there was a sharp crack, a hiss of ancient air escaping, and the top half of the sphere moved. It didn't open completely. It just came loose, like the lid of a very tight jar that gives way suddenly. Martha let out a startled sound. Silas stood still. Then, very carefully, his hands trembling a little and trying not to let it show, he lifted off the stone lid. Inside the sphere, there was a hollow space, dry by some miracle he couldn't explain, and inside that space was a leather bundle, shriveled and dark as old wood, but intact. He took out the bundle with both hands. He climbed out of the hole. Martha had her hand over her mouth. He sat on the edge, his feet still inside the hole, and unfolded the leather very carefully. The folds were stiff, but didn't break. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, folded many times, thin as skin but whole, and the ink on them had survived time in a way that seemed impossible. He couldn't read everything there. The handwriting was old, cursive in a way no one used anymore, but some words were clear enough. He saw a name. He saw a date. He saw a sketch that he recognized immediately as the drawing of a land boundary. And then he understood that the sphere wasn't a mystery. It was a little box, a promise buried by a man who lacked the courage to honor it in life, but also lacked the courage to destroy it. The question now was different. What was he going to do with it? Silas returned to his mother's house with the bundle in his hand. He sat at the table with her and Martha for over an hour, talking in low voices, weighing every word. They were 3 people trying to resolve in one day something that had remained unresolved for over a century. Martha wanted to take it to an expert, someone who could confirm what was written before any decision was made. Mrs. Beatrice wanted Silas to go speak with Caleb Harrison before anything else. "This belongs to his family as much as this land belongs to yours," she said, "and you know that now." Silas said nothing. He just stared at the leather bundle on the table, as if waiting for it to speak. The problem wasn't just what was inside the bundle, it was what it meant. If the documents were authentic, if the original agreement between the 2 great-grandfathers had been what Mrs. Beatrice believed it was, then a part of the land Silas had worked his whole life, that his father had worked, that his grandfather had worked, wasn't theirs. It had never been fully theirs. And Caleb Harrison, a man he barely spoke to, was the heir to that. There are things you discover and wish you had remained ignorant of, but life doesn't give you that choice. The meeting happened 2 days later, because Silas needed 2 days to muster up the courage to go to the fence separating the 2 properties and call for his neighbor. Caleb was 63 years old, older than Silas by nearly a decade, and between them lay that kind of harshness that builds up over years of small, unsettled grievances. A poorly mended fence here, an animal that wandered onto the wrong side there, little things that thickened with time. When Silas called him, Caleb came with his usual suspicious look. "What is it?" "I need to show you something. It's been a while since I invited you in here, but today I have to ask." Caleb stared at him. "What's this about?" "I found something on my back 40, buried deep. And what was inside it concerns you." The silence lasted a moment. Caleb crossed his arms. "Concerns me how?" "In the most direct way possible. Come with me." They went. Caleb saw the hole, saw what remained of the opened sphere, heard Silas explain how he had found it, how he had opened it, what Mrs. Beatrice had said. He heard everything without interrupting, which was something Silas hadn't expected from him. When they reached the table where the leather bundle was waiting, Caleb stared at that old object for a long time before touching it. Mrs. Beatrice was sitting in her usual chair. Martha served water for both without anyone asking. "Did you read this?" Caleb asked. "I read what I could. The handwriting is hard to make out. And you understood what it says? Enough. Caleb remained silent for another moment. Then, in a very unexpected way, he pulled out a chair and sat down. Not on the edge, like someone ready to leave. He sat properly, deep, like someone who intends to stay. My grandfather, he said slowly, once told me there was a debt between this family and yours. He didn't explain what it was, just said there was a debt and that one day it would be collected or forgiven, but he wouldn't live to see it. He paused. I thought it was a figure of speech, old man talk. Mrs. Beatrice smiled from across the table. Old folks talk in figures of speech because it's easier than the plain truth. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, what came next was a conversation that lasted until nightfall. 4 people around a table, 2 old documents that an expert in ancient script from the nearby town was called in to confirm 2 days later, and a story over 100 years old that had finally been spoken aloud. The map indicated a strip of land along the east side of Silas's property, about 40 meters wide, along the entire length of the lot. A strip that, according to the document, should have been transferred to the Harrison family on a date that neither Silas nor Caleb could reach from their own memory. It hadn't been, for reasons that the documents didn't fully explain, but that Mrs. Beatrice had a theory about. Your great-grandfather, she said to Silas, but looking at Caleb, was a good man from what they say. But he was a man with many mouths to feed and little land to divide. I think he made the wrong decision for a reason that was too human. And then he couldn't destroy the evidence because he knew it was wrong. And then he buried it. No one said anything for a moment. What a complicated man, said Martha quietly. Most of us are, Mrs. Beatrice replied. The expert came. He confirmed that the documents were old enough to match the estimated time period, that the ink was of a composition no longer manufactured for a long time, and that the names written there corresponded to the families that both described. There was no way to prove it with absolute certainty, without a series of tests that would cost more than either of them could afford, but he said that in his many years of experience dealing with old papers from that region, it had every appearance of being genuine, and it was then that Silas faced the hardest decision of his life. There was no obligation. No one knew about it except those in the room. Martha had said in a private conversation the night before that it was their son's money, their granddaughter's, that strip of land was worth something. She wasn't being selfish, she was being a mother and grandmother, and Silas understood that. He himself had spent a sleepless night thinking about exactly that. But there was another thing that stayed awake with him, the image of his great-grandfather burying that sphere, a man who knew he was doing something wrong but couldn't correct it, who left the truth there under the ground, intact, waiting, maybe waiting for someone braver than him to come along one day. On the morning of the 3rd day, Silas went to the fence again. He called Caleb. I've thought a lot, he said. I've slept little. I talked to Martha. I talked to my mother. And I need to tell you something. Caleb looked at him without blinking. This land that's on the map is yours. It was always your family's. What my great-grandfather did was wrong, and I can't undo what he did. But I can do what he didn't do. Silas stopped. He took a breath. I'm going to transfer this strip to you, the right way, at the county land registry, the way it should have been done back then. Caleb stood still. For a time that Silas couldn't quite measure, the two just looked at each other over that fence that had been the cause of so much discord. Then Caleb said something Silas didn't expect. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, that's why I'm doing it. This will cost you. I know. Does your wife agree? Silas hesitated. She got there. It took a while, but she got there. Caleb looked at the ground. Then he looked at the horizon, at the golden back 40 that stretched behind the two properties. He stayed like that for a while. My mother, he said finally, is 80 years old. She spent her whole life hearing that there was something wrong between the two families, but never knowing what. She blamed your ancestors. She blamed mine. She made a suffering out of it that lasted decades. He paused. "I would like her to know what happened, the whole story. You want me to go there and tell her?" "No. I want you and your mother to come over for dinner at my place, and we'll tell it together." Silas stared at his neighbor, that man with whom he had exchanged more harsh words than kind ones over the years, and he felt something stir inside his chest, that kind of thing that has no name, but that you recognize when it happens. "All right," he said. The dinner took place the following Saturday. Silas, Martha, and Mrs. Beatrice went to the Harrisons' house, where Caleb lived with his mother, Mrs. Esther, 80 years old, hair white as cotton, eyes still lively and attentive. The leather bundle was placed in the center of the kitchen table on a white cloth as if it were something sacred. Mrs. Esther heard everything. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She stayed very quiet, as people do who have seen a lot in life and know that true emotion doesn't need noise to exist. When everyone finished speaking, she took the leather bundle with trembling hands and held it for a moment. "My grandmother used to tell me," she began, with a voice slightly hoarse from someone who has more memory than present, "that the land keeps what we don't have the courage to say, that it's more honest than any person." She looked at Silas. "Your machine found this by chance?" "The hoe." "And yes, ma'am, by chance." She nodded slowly. "It wasn't by chance. It was at the right time." I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but there are times when real life is more beautiful than anything we could invent. The land transfer was done at the county land registry in the nearby town 6 weeks later. It wasn't simple, because these things never are. There were papers, there was waiting, there was a moment when a clerk looked at the old documents with an expression that suggested it all seemed too unlikely to be taken seriously. But Silas was patient, and Caleb was too, and at the end of the process there was a strip of land transferred the right way, the way it should have been generations ago. Neither of them celebrated with a party. Caleb sent a box of oranges from his own tree to Silas, who sent back a sack of corn. It was their way of saying what they didn't know how to say with words. And the wire fence between the two properties? It stayed there for a few more months. But one October afternoon, Caleb showed up with a roll of new wire and a tool in his hand, and Silas went over without anyone asking, and the two of them fixed every rotten post, every loose end, every stretch that had been a cause for argument, without saying a word about any of it, just working side by side in the silence of the late afternoon, with the golden back 40 all around, and the sun slowly setting on the horizon. Mrs. Beatrice found out from her son later. She was silent for a moment, then said, "That's what I call making peace with the land." And the sphere? Silas left it in the hole for a while, not knowing what to do. Then, in a decision he made on his own one sleepless night, he went there with a wheelbarrow, took the sphere out with Caleb's help, and the two of them placed it in a corner between the two properties, on a pile of stones they improvised as a base. It remains there to this day, between the two plots, large and cracked and covered in moss like a landmark. A reminder. Mrs. Esther, when she found out, said she wanted to see it. Caleb took her one quiet afternoon. She walked slowly with the support of her son's arm, stopped in front of the sphere, and stared at it for a long time. Then she placed her hand on the cracked surface, with that delicacy of someone touching something they understand. "More than 100 years waiting," she said, "a stone more patient than any person I've ever known." End of the story. This story stuck in my head for a long time. The idea that a man who did something wrong couldn't destroy the evidence, because deep down he knew the truth was bigger than him, and that truth stayed waiting in the land, quiet, until someone with more courage came along. Tell us, do you think Silas did the right thing by giving back that land, even though he didn't have to? What would you have done in his place? Leave it in the comments. We read every single one with great care. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end, truly. Don't forget to hit like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.